When I first bought the piece of land at the edge of our neighborhood, it wasn't much to look at, just a stretch of neglected property with wild grass, a few trees, and an old fence leaning so far sideways it looked like a stiff breeze could knock it down. But what the HOA president didn't realize was that I had done my homework. I knew this land wasn't part of the neighborhood's controlled territory, meaning it didn't fall under her endless rules about what color your mailbox should be or how long your lawn could grow before she sent you nasty letters. And while she treated me like some clueless newcomer, smirking whenever I drove past her perfectly manicured mansion with her imported fountains and designer hedges, I quietly filed away every interaction, knowing she underestimated me. And it all started the day she called me to a neighborly meeting in the HOA clubhouse, which felt more like a courtroom than a community center, with its sterile lighting and long polished table, where she told me in her condescending voice that she had plans for the land I had purchased, plans that involved a community enhancement project, which in plain English meant she wanted to seize it for her own benefit. But I simply smiled, nodded, and pretended to be intimidated as she pulled out what looked like architectural sketches of a massive villa. Her dream home, complete with a pool, a private tennis court, and even a wine cellar beneath it all, and the audacity in her tone as she explained how great it would be for property values almost made me laugh, because what she really meant was that she wanted to build herself a palace while convincing everyone else it was somehow for the good of the neighborhood. Yet instead of confronting her or threatening legal action, I decided to play the long game because patience was something she clearly lacked, and I had plenty of it. So, when construction trucks began showing up on my land, I acted like I didn't notice. I didn't complain. I didn't call the police or the zoning office. I just let her build, stone by stone, room by room, until that patch of grass turned into a gleaming multimillion-dollar villa. Because I knew one thing she didn't: every dollar she poured into that property was going into my pocket. And while neighbors whispered about how generous she was for spearheading such a community project, I kept my head down, waited, and documented everything with photos, surveys, and the original deed. Locked up in a safe, and sometimes at night, I'd drive by just to watch the crews under the floodlights, pouring concrete for a foundation that wasn't hers, raising walls that didn't belong to her. And I would think about how sweet the day would be when she realized she had built a $6 million villa on land she didn't own, a day that would come sooner than she thought, but not as soon as she feared, because I wasn't going to stop her, not yet, not while her arrogance blinded her to the truth that she was investing in my future without even realizing it. And as weeks turned into months and the skeleton of her dream home turned into a masterpiece that could rival anything in a luxury magazine, I kept my cool, smiled at her in the grocery store, waved when I saw her jogging with her designer dog, and even agreed when she bragged about her project being the jewel of the neighborhood. And every time she thought she was winning, I was simply pulling the noose tighter, waiting for the moment. She would finish, put the last tile in place, pop the champagne to celebrate, and then, only then, would I strike with the paperwork that proved it was mine all along and that her greed had built me a fortune. The funniest part about the whole ordeal was how convinced the HOA president was that she had already beaten me, as if her status, her money, and her influence in the neighborhood were some kind of magic shield that made her untouchable. But what she didn't understand was that I had no interest in fighting her on her battlefield, because if I had gone to the HOA board, they would have backed her. If I had called the county inspector, she would have pulled strings. And if I had tried to stop her, crews with police involvement, she would have spun the narrative into me being the difficult neighbor who was blocking progress. So instead, I watched her play her game, confident that she was in control, while I quietly played mine, the game of patience, legality, and ownership. And the deeper she sank into her fantasy, the better my hand became, because as the villa grew taller and more extravagant, with massive columns imported from Italy, glass windows stretching 2 stories high, and landscaping crews reshaping the earth to fit her vision of paradise, she was investing not only money but ego. And the human ego is a dangerous thing when it becomes so bloated that it blinds you to risk, and hers was swollen beyond belief, especially the day she hosted an informal tour of the unfinished villa for the other HOA board members, strutting through the half-finished hallways in her designer heels, talking about how it would elevate the neighborhood while sipping champagne in A. hard hat, completely ignoring the fact that she was technically trespassing on my land because in her mind she had already claimed it. And what shocked me was how none of the others questioned her. They just nodded along, too intimidated or too charmed to challenge her. And that was the moment I realized how deep her delusion ran. She thought the rules didn't apply to her, that she could reshape reality by sheer willpower, but reality is stubborn and paperwork is even more so, and every time I saw the latest upgrades, like the imported marble floors, the infinity pool with a view of the hills, and the private theater she bragged about, I felt the grin tugging at the corners of my mouth because she had no idea she was signing over her wealth to me brick by brick, and I wasn't idle while she built. No, I was busy too, consulting lawyers quietly, making sure my deed was airtight, recording every drone photo and video of the construction, and even requesting official surveys that clearly marked the property lines because I knew when the time came she'd scream, she'd accuse, she'd claim it was hers, and she'd try to bury me under lawsuits. But I would have a mountain of evidence ready to crush every attempt. And the more she built, the more confident I became, until one evening I happened to drive past and saw her standing at the gate of the construction site, watching the sunset behind her half-complete villa with the smug look of a queen surveying her kingdom. And I laughed out loud in my car because in her mind she was the queen, but in reality she was a tenant building a palace for her landlord, and soon the lease would come due. And while I kept my mask of indifference in public, my closest friends started to notice I had a secret, asking why I didn't stop the construction, why I let her walk all over me, and I just shrugged and said, patience. Because how could I explain that the sweetest victory is the one you don't rush, the one that ripens, slowly until it drops into your lap fully formed, and by the time winter rolled around and the villa was nearly finished, I had already imagined a dozen ways the reveal would go. Would I show up with the sheriff and eviction papers the moment she moved in? Or would I let her host a grand housewarming party and then pull the rug out? Or maybe I'd wait until she finally registered the property with the county, only to discover the title was never hers, and the thought of her face in that moment was enough to keep me patient, because while she was building walls of stone, I was building walls of strategy, and mine would never crack. By the time spring came, the villa was nearly complete, and it was nothing short of breathtaking, at least from an architectural standpoint, though every time I looked at it, I saw not her triumph, but my harvest ripening in the sun. And what fascinated me most was how brazen she had become, parading around as though the land was hers, telling everyone within earshot about her vision realized, while even going as far as hiring a local magazine to do a feature on her project, complete with glossy photos of the progress and her standing in front of it like some kind of celebrity developer. And I couldn't help but marvel at how blind arrogance can make a person, because while she was busy taking photo shoots, I was sitting in a lawyer's office reviewing documents that spelled out in black and white that she was essentially squatting on my property, albeit in a very expensive and elaborate way. And I remember my lawyer leaning back in his chair, chuckling as he said, "She has no idea. She's building you a mansion," and I nodded because that was the truth, and as we discussed strategies, the options became clearer. I could wait until the villa was entirely complete, let her pour every last cent into it, and then file a quiet title action which would bring the courts into play, or I could simply wait for her to register the property with the county, which would trigger an automatic clash between her false claims and my legally documented ownership, and though my lawyer warned me about the storm that would come, lawsuits, threats, smear campaigns, I told him I was ready because I wasn't just planning to take the villa, I was planning to expose her for the fraud she was, to peel back the glossy mask she wore in the neighborhood and show everyone the greedy, self-serving tyrant beneath it. And part of me knew that the humiliation would sting her even more than the financial loss, because for someone like her, image was everything, and while she was polishing hers with fake charm and expensive parties, I was quietly sharpening mine with patience and truth, and the contrast couldn't have been more perfect. And one day, as I walked past the construction site, pretending to admire the progress, she stopped me with that smirk of hers and said, "Quite the upgrade to the neighborhood, don't you think?" And though I wanted to laugh in her face, I simply nodded and replied, "It's impressive," because I knew that every word I spoke in agreement only deepened her delusion, making the eventual fall that much harder. And later that week, I overheard her at a community gathering boasting that she had personally invested over $6 million into the villa, not counting the imported art pieces and custom furniture she had on order, and my heart nearly skipped a beat because the number was higher than I had imagined, which only made the waiting sweeter. And as I watched her sip wine and brag about how she had outdone herself, I realized that she had. No exit strategy, no backup plan. She was all in. And once the truth came out, she would be ruined socially, financially, and legally. And yet she kept barreling forward as though nothing could touch her. And in that moment, I understood just how perfect this trap had become because she had built it with her own pride. And soon enough, she'd walk right into it, unprepared for the slam of reality that would remind her of the one thing she could never change: the ground beneath her palace didn't belong to her, and the deed was still in my name, waiting like a silent weapon I could unleash the moment she thought she had won. The grand unveiling came sooner than I expected, because as soon as the final touches were complete, the gold-plated fixtures in the bathrooms, the crystal chandeliers dangling from the 20-foot ceilings, the imported French doors that opened to the infinity pool, she wasted no time in throwing a lavish housewarming party that she framed as a neighborhood gala, sending out embossed invitations with her name in bold letters and the address printed as though it were hers by divine right. And when I received mine, slipped under my door by one of her minions, I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee, because the sheer arrogance of inviting me to celebrate a house she had illegally built on my land was almost too delicious to believe. But of course, I went not just to witness her smug display, but to savor the moment of watching her bask in her fantasy, while knowing I held the blade that could cut it all down. And the night of the party, the villa was lit up like a palace, with valet drivers parking imported cars along the winding driveway, waiters in crisp uniforms carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and a string quartet playing softly in the marble foyer as guests marveled at the extravagance of it all. And there she was, the self-proclaimed queen, dressed in a glittering gown, holding a glass of champagne, and smiling as though the world revolved around her, giving speeches about how this villa would be the crown jewel of the community and how she had personally overseen every detail, never once acknowledging that the ground beneath her stiletto heels wasn't hers. And as I walked through the halls, admiring the craftsmanship and the obscene luxury, I couldn't help but grin at the thought that every chandelier, every inch of imported marble, every brush stroke of the frescoed ceiling was legally mine, and it felt like walking through a treasure vault where the owner didn't even realize they had already lost the keys. And though several neighbors whispered to me, asking how I felt about her achievement, I simply raised my glass and said, "It's impressive, isn't it?" Because I wanted the illusion to last just a little longer, wanted her to sink fully into the belief that she was untouchable, because when the fall came, it would be catastrophic. And as the night wore on and the champagne flowed, she even took me aside, smirking as she said, "See, I told you this land would be better in my hands." And it took everything in me not to burst into laughter, but instead I leaned in and replied softly, "Enjoy it while you can," a cryptic remark that she brushed off as sour grapes, never suspecting the storm waiting just around the corner. And later that week, when she filed the paperwork with the county to register her new villa under her name, that's when the machine I had built in silence roared to life, because the county clerk, upon cross-referencing, found my deed, my surveys, my documents, all carefully prepared and airtight. And within days, a notice was sent back to her declaring her filing invalid, sparking a chain reaction that would unravel her empire, though she didn't know it yet. And as I sat in my living room, sipping coffee and reading the copy of the rejection notice my lawyer had sent me, I felt the first real taste of victory, not because I had won outright, but because the first crack had appeared in the flawless facade she had built. And soon those cracks would widen, spreading like fractures through marble, until the entire structure of her lies came crumbling down. And I promised myself that I wouldn't need to rush, because the wheels of the law grind slowly, but when they do, they grind exceedingly fine. And by the time she realized what was happening, it would already be too late for her to escape the truth that the $6 million villa she had bragged about, celebrated in, and poured her soul into was never hers at all, it was mine. The fallout began almost immediately after the county's rejection notice landed in her mailbox, because instead of quietly seeking clarification or trying to understand the situation, she stormed into the clerk's office like a woman possessed, demanding answers in her shrill, commanding tone that usually bullied people into submission. But the clerk, backed by black and white documents and county records, simply pointed her to the survey maps and ownership history that listed my name clearly as the rightful owner, and witnesses later told me how her face twisted from outrage to disbelief to outright denial as she sputtered, "That land belongs to me. I built my home there." And the clerk, unfazed, replied calmly, "Ma'am, the land isn't yours no matter what you built on it." And that single line shattered her composure, though she quickly tried to rally, threatening lawsuits, boasting about her connections, insisting that there had been some clerical error. But the county staff were professionals and they knew the truth, and within hours word began to spread in whispers across the neighborhood that the queen of the HOA had built her $6 million palace on someone else's property, and that someone was me. And though I kept my public demeanor cool and collected, inside I was savoring every morsel of her downfall, because now the story was no longer just between us. It had become gossip, and gossip in a neighborhood spreads faster than wildfire, and each retelling added more fuel, painting her as reckless, arrogant, and possibly even criminal. And as the rumors swirled, I prepared the next step, filing official papers. Through my lawyer to assert my ownership and claim legal rights over the villa, which, thanks to property law, automatically transferred to me as the landowner since she had never secured any agreements or permissions. And while the legal process churned forward, she launched into damage control, calling emergency HOA meetings where she tried to spin the narrative, claiming I was a liar, that I had tricked her, that somehow I had stolen her investment. But the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded, and neighbors who once bowed to her iron rule began to exchange skeptical glances, realizing that for once she wasn't in control. And at one particularly heated meeting, when she tried to rally the board against me, I calmly stood, produced copies of the deed, and laid them on the table for everyone to see, and the silence that followed was sweeter than any applause, because no one could deny the truth in black and white. And I will never forget the look on her face, cocktail of rage and humiliation, as she realized her empire was slipping through her manicured fingers. And the best part was that I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to gloat or shout. I just let the facts speak for themselves. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted permanently, and though she left that meeting with her head held high, pretending as though she still had cards to play, I knew the truth. She was cornered, and the more she fought, the deeper she would dig herself into a pit she couldn't escape, because every threat she made, every claim she shouted, only further exposed her arrogance and ignorance, while I, armed with patience and proof, simply tightened the net, waiting for the inevitable moment when not even her wealth, her charm, or her bluster could save her from the reality that the villa, the glittering monument to her ego, belonged to me, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to change it. The weeks that followed were like watching a slow-motion implosion, because the more the HOA president tried to claw her way out of the hole she had dug, the deeper she sank, and her desperation became more visible with every passing day. One morning she went door to door, something she had never done before, trying to convince neighbors individually that I had somehow conned her, waving her arms dramatically and spinning tales about how I was exploiting a technicality. But the harder she pushed, the less convincing she became, because neighbors knew she was meticulous about rules, contracts, and property boundaries whenever it came to finding them for grass that grew half an inch too tall or holiday lights left up a day too long. And now here she was trying to argue that paperwork didn't matter, that deeds were trivial compared to her investment, and people began to whisper about the hypocrisy, shaking their heads at the woman who had once ruled the community with an iron fist, now reduced to pleading. And though she still strutted around in her designer outfits, the cracks were showing, dark circles under her eyes, a tightness in her jaw, and a frantic edge to her voice that betrayed the fear she was trying to hide. And behind the scenes, my lawyer kept me updated as her legal team scrambled to mount a defense, filing motions to delay proceedings, claiming adverse possession, even suggesting I had committed fraud. But each attempt was met with the cold, hard reality. of documented proof, and when depositions began, it became clear she had no solid ground to stand on because every contractor she had hired confirmed she had directed the construction without ever showing them a proper deed. And when asked why she never verified the property boundaries before breaking ground, she stammered excuses about assumed authority, which only made her look even more reckless. And while all this was happening, I kept my composure, going about my daily life as though nothing unusual was unfolding, but inside I was relishing the poetic justice of it all, because here was a woman who had lorded power over everyone for years, now exposed as careless and arrogant, and the very rules she had used to control others were now crushing her, and the best part was, I didn't have to lift a finger beyond letting the law run its course, because each day brought me closer to not only owning the villa outright, but also watching her empire crumble, and I knew the humiliation was eating her alive, because for someone like her, money was power, but reputation was oxygen, and now both were slipping away, replaced by whispers, lawsuits, and the looming reality that the housewarming party she had thrown with such fanfare was nothing more than a prelude to her downfall. Because soon, very soon, the locks on that glittering villa would be changed, and the keys would be mine. The court hearing was the true turning point, the moment when all the tension that had been building for months finally came to a head, and though she arrived in her usual fashion, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, heels clicking across the marble floor, flanked by her team of lawyers, as though she were royalty entering her throne room. Her confidence was a brittle mask that began to crack the moment the judge asked for documentation, because while she produced glossy photographs of the villa, invoices from contractors, and bank statements showing the millions she had spent, none of it proved ownership of the land itself. Whereas my lawyer calmly slid across the table the original deed, the updated surveys, and the stack of rejection notices from the county clerk, all neatly organized and indisputable, and as the judge flipped through the pages, I could see her posture stiffen, her lips press into a thin line, and for the first time I realized she understood the weight of what was happening, that her empire of bluster was colliding with the immovable wall of fact. And when the judge finally looked up and said, "Ma'am, you built on land that you do not own," the silence in that courtroom was deafening, broken only by her sputtering protests about fairness, about equity, about how it was obvious that she had intended to own it. But the law is not built on intention, it is built on evidence, and the evidence was stacked entirely on my side, and as her lawyers scrambled to argue adverse possession, the judge shut them down, pointing out that construction had only begun recently and that I had not abandoned the land, that in fact I had meticulously maintained my ownership, and with each rebuttal, her defense shriveled until it was little more than a hollow plea for sympathy, which the judge dismissed with professional detachment, and though she tried to regain her footing by painting me as opportunistic, by accusing me of waiting deliberately for her to finish before stepping in, my lawyer countered smoothly. The defendant never once sought permission, never once verified the property line, and acted entirely on her own assumption of authority. My client cannot be faulted for her reckless disregard of the law, and the judge nodded in agreement, which was the final nail in her coffin, because at that moment the outcome was inevitable, and when the ruling was delivered, declaring me the rightful owner of both the land and the villa constructed upon it, her face drained of color, as though the weight of $6 million had just been ripped from her shoulders and handed to me in one swift motion. And though she tried to storm out, dramatically muttering threats of appeals and vengeance, I barely noticed because all I could feel was the rush of vindication, the knowledge that patience had paid off exactly as I had planned, and as I walked out of that courtroom with the papers in hand, neighbors who had come to watch gave me discreet nods, some even small smiles, because though few would say it aloud, everyone loved seeing the mighty brought low, and in that moment, I realized I hadn't just won a house, I had won the narrative, the truth, and the respect of a community that had once been cowed into silence by her tyranny, and now they saw her for what she truly was, a fraud undone by her own arrogance. After the ruling, the shockwaves through the neighborhood were immediate and unstoppable, because gossip that had once been whispered in corners now exploded into open conversation, with neighbors discussing the downfall of the once mighty HOA president in their driveways at backyard barbecues, and in online forums dedicated to local news. And though she tried desperately to maintain her grip on power, sending out long-winded HOA newsletters about unjust rulings and ongoing appeals, no one was buying it anymore because the facts were plain to see, and while she clung to the tattered remnants of her influence, I was quietly preparing to take physical possession of the villa, working with my lawyer and the county to transfer utilities, file final paperwork, and secure the rights that had now been legally recognized as mine, and each step felt surreal, like moving closer to a prize I had already won but hadn't yet touched. And when the day finally came to change the locks, I stood at the front gates of the glittering $6 million villa with a locksmith by my side, staring up at the massive iron gates that she had chosen so proudly, and I couldn't help but smile at the irony that they now swung open for me, not her. And as the locksmith worked, a few curious neighbors gathered at a distance, watching the symbolic moment when control shifted. And when the doors finally creaked open, I walked into the villa as its rightful owner for the first time, my footsteps echoing across polished marble floors, past towering chandeliers and hand-carved wooden banisters, and though everything was lavish, what struck me most was how hollow it felt, because for all her arrogance and all her money, she had poured her soul into this place, only to see it ripped away, leaving behind a hollow monument to her greed. And as I wandered through the vast halls, inspecting the theater room, the wine cellar, the indoor spa, I realized the villa wasn't just a prize, it was a statement. Proof that arrogance without humility builds castles on sand doomed to collapse, and though I reveled in the victory, I also felt a strange calm, a satisfaction that came not from owning luxury, but from knowing I had endured, I had been patient, and the law had vindicated me completely. And meanwhile, she was unraveling because neighbors told me she had taken to late-night rants on social media, posting videos where she accused me of theft and betrayal, though the more she shouted, the more ridiculous she looked, until even her closest allies distanced themselves, leaving her isolated in a mansion-sized mistake she no longer controlled. And as the weeks passed, I moved my belongings into the villa slowly, deliberately, taking my time to savor the process, inviting a few trusted friends over to celebrate, and each glass of champagne we raised felt like a toast not just to the property, but to patience, justice, and the poetic downfall of a woman who had once believed herself invincible, because now, standing in the home she had built for herself but delivered into my hands, I knew that the true victory wasn't just the villa. It was watching her empire of arrogance crumble, brick by brick, until nothing remained but whispers of her folly and the shining reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves. Of course, victory didn't mean the war was completely over, because true to her nature, the former HOA president refused to surrender quietly, filing one appeal after another, dragging out the legal process in a desperate attempt to reclaim even a shred of what she had lost. But each motion she filed was struck down swiftly, the courts unwilling to entertain arguments that had already been shredded in the first trial, and with each rejection, her desperation grew more visible, spilling over into public spectacles where she would corner neighbors on the street or interrupt community gatherings to rant about injustice. But the more she raged, the more isolated she became, until even those who had once feared her power began avoiding her altogether, leaving her a hollow figure wandering the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist. And though part of me expected to feel pity, I couldn't muster it, because this was the same woman who had fined people for trivial infractions, who had bullied families into silence, who had treated the community as her personal kingdom, and now she was tasting the bitter medicine of her own arrogance. And while she spiraled, I was building a new chapter, transforming the villa not just into a home, but into a sanctuary that reflected patience and resilience rather than greed and vanity, adding personal touches that made it mine, from hanging family photos on the towering walls to planting a modest garden in the sprawling backyard. And as I worked, neighbors would occasionally stop by, offering congratulations, some even thanking me for standing up to her, saying it felt like the entire neighborhood had been freed from a tyrant's grip. And their words reminded me that this battle had never been just about land or money. It had been about principles, about proving that arrogance and entitlement cannot overrule truth. And every time I walked through the villa's gleaming halls, I felt not just pride but vindication because this was the house arrogance built and humility claimed. And though she still lurked in the background, muttering threats of some grand comeback, the reality was clear. Her reputation was destroyed, her finances drained, her allies gone, and the very monument she had built to showcase her power now stood as a daily reminder of her downfall. And as months passed, her presence in the community dwindled until one day I heard she had quietly put her own personal mansion up for sale, unable to keep up with debts and legal fees. And while she vanished from the neighborhood like a storm that had burned itself out, I remained steady and unshaken, living in the villa she had built for me with her own arrogance. And every evening as I stood on the balcony overlooking the hills, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. She had dreamed of standing here as queen, but fate had chosen otherwise, and in the end, it wasn't her wealth or power that won. It was patience, truth, and the quiet certainty of justice. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories, but whenever I walk through the grand villa that now serves as my home, I'm reminded of the extraordinary chain of events that brought me here, and though at first it felt surreal to inhabit a palace someone else had envisioned, over time it became more than just a trophy of victory. It became a living symbol of patience, persistence, and the unshakable truth that arrogance always carries the seeds of its own destruction, and as seasons passed, the whispers in the neighborhood shifted from gossip about the former HOA president's downfall to admiration for how I had handled the entire ordeal, not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet determination, and that respect manifested in ways I never expected. Invitations to join community boards, neighbors seeking my advice instead of avoiding me, people greeting me with genuine warmth instead of suspicion, and in those small, everyday moments, I realized that the true prize wasn't the villa itself, but the trust and respect of a community that had once been ruled by fear. And though the HOA president had tried to appeal, to scream, to claw back her power, eventually even she disappeared from the neighborhood entirely, retreating into obscurity while her former palace stood tall under my name, a constant reminder of how her empire had collapsed under its own weight. And sometimes when I sit in the sprawling backyard, listening to the gentle trickle of water from the infinity pool, I reflect on how easily the story could have gone differently if I had rushed to stop her, if I had let frustration dictate my choices, if I had confronted her head on instead of letting her arrogance trap her, because the victory was never about brute force. It was about strategy, restraint, and letting time work its magic, and that realization carried into other parts of my life, teaching me patience in business, in relationships, and even in the way I approach challenges, because now I knew firsthand that some battles are best won not by charging but by waiting, and though there are still moments when I catch myself chuckling at the sheer absurdity of it all, that she had the gall to build a $6 million villa on land she didn't own, that she had even invited me to celebrate it with her, that she had boasted so loudly only to lose it all, I also feel a strange sense of closure, because while her story ended in disgrace, mine began anew, forged in the fire of her downfall, but carried forward with humility and steadiness. And as I look ahead, I know the villa isn't just a house, it's a legacy, one that tells everyone who sees it a simple truth. Greed may build castles, arrogance may lay the stones, but in the end, only patience and truth can claim the crown. And that crown now rests quietly on my head, not because I seized it, but because she handed it to me unknowingly when she decided to build her dream palace on soil that was never hers. And sometimes when the sun sets and golden light pours through the tall windows, I raise a glass of wine to the empty air and whisper, almost as if she can still hear me, "Thank you for building my home.